He was the most beautiful man in Hollywood, and he spent his career making the industry deeply uncomfortable. Not because of the beauty, Hollywood has always known what to do with beautiful men. Because of what he did with it. He took a face that could have coasted on charm for 50 years and pointed it at China's occupation of Tibet in front of 1 billion people at the Academy Awards, and the industry recoiled like he'd set off a flare in a boardroom. Directors told him, to his face, that they could not put him in their films because it would upset the Chinese. Producers walked away from financing deals the moment his name came up. The most famous face in 90s Hollywood became, quietly, a man the studios preferred not to call. And he kept going anyway. Not in spite of the cost. Understanding the cost completely and paying it deliberately every single time. That is the story nobody expected from the man who stood in a rain-soaked factory yard in his Navy uniform, holding Deborah Winger above his head while an officer and a gentleman's entire audience collectively stopped breathing. Not a political story, not a story about principle versus commerce, but it is the most complete portrait of who Richard Gere actually is, and understanding it changes the way you watch every performance he ever gave before the world knew he was capable of it. Have you ever watched someone use the thing the world most valued about them, their fame, their face, their access, to say exactly what the world's most powerful commercial interests did not want said? Because Richard Gere did that, repeatedly, at enormous personal professional cost. And what he built in place of the studio career he sacrificed is a story that Hollywood never figured out how to categorize. But Syracuse comes first. North Syracuse, New York, in the 1950s, in a Methodist household where Homer Gere sold insurance and Doris Gere kept the home and 5 children occupied, and where the second child, Richard Tiffany Gere, was already becoming 2 things simultaneously that would define his entire life: a musician and a seeker. Richard Tiffany Gere was born on the 31st of August, 1949, in Philadelphia, and grew up in the suburbs of Syracuse in a solidly conventional middle-class family with deep American roots. Both parents were Mayflower descendants, the lineage going back to pilgrims who had crossed the Atlantic and decided to stay. The house was Methodist, the childhood was stable, and Richard Gere, from adolescence onward, was finding it insufficient. He played the trumpet, he played guitar, piano, bass. He was a gymnast good enough to earn a scholarship. He wrote music for his high school productions. He graduated from North Syracuse Central High School in 1967 and enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst on a gymnastics scholarship, declared philosophy as his major, and lasted 2 years before the combination of theater and the question of what the mind actually was pulled him away from formal education entirely. He was not, at 20, the kind of young man who intended to become a sex symbol. He was the kind of young man who intended to find something true. He worked in theater in Seattle and on Cape Cod. He appeared in small productions. He took a lead role in the London production of Grease in 1973. He was, by the mid-70s, a compelling stage presence building quietly toward a film career that would arrive with sudden and violent force. Looking for Mr. Goodbar in 1977 gave him a small but striking role. Days of Heaven in 1978, Terrence Malick's ravishing, elliptical drama shot in the golden hour light of the Texas Panhandle announced something that the casual viewer might have missed, but that the film world could not. This was an actor of genuine interior life, not just a face. Have you ever watched someone do something so well, in a medium that values surface above almost everything, that you had to look twice to understand what was actually happening? That is the quality Days of Heaven introduced into Richard Gere's career. The restraint, the stillness, a screen presence that came from something internal, not performed. American Gigolo in 1980 changed everything, and changed it in the most complicated possible way. Julian Kay, the character, was a male escort in Los Angeles, preternaturally beautiful, impeccably dressed, Giorgio Armani suits that moved the designer from European fashion houses to American mainstream consciousness overnight. Gere played him with a studied blankness that was, on close examination, not emptiness, but concealment. A man who had built a beautiful exterior over something he did not entirely understand about himself. The film made Gere a sex symbol in the most literal industrial sense of the term. His face was on every magazine, his name attached to every conversation about male beauty in American film. And he has spent much of the intervening 45 years slightly unnerved by what that did to the perception of his actual talent. An Officer and a Gentleman in 1982 was the role the industry believed proved what it thought it already knew, that Richard Gere was a romantic lead, and that the romantic lead was the ceiling. The film grossed $129 million on a $7 million budget. It won 2 Academy Awards. The final scene, Gere in uniform, walking through the factory floor, lifting Deborah Winger into his arms while Joe Cocker played, became one of the defining images of the decade. He received his first Golden Globe nomination. He was 32 years old. He was, by every metric the industry used, at the precise peak of where the industry wanted him to stay. And then he went to Nepal. The Buddhism had started quietly in his early 20s, when a study of philosophy led him to Zen, and Zen led him, gradually, to a question he couldn't resolve within the tradition: what does the mind actually want? In 1978, he and a companion traveled to Nepal, where he met Tibetan monks and lamas for the first time. The encounter was, by his own account, decisive. He has described it as the experience of meeting people who had genuinely resolved something that he had only managed to approach intellectually. A quality of peace that was not passive or resigned, but active, deliberate, grounded in the understanding that compassion was not a sentiment, but a practice. He met the Dalai Lama. He became a practicing Tibetan Buddhist of the Gelugpa school. He began building a relationship with the exiled leader that would, 15 years later, change the shape of his professional life entirely. The 1980s produced films of varying reception. The Cotton Club in 1984, King David in 1985, Power in 1986, Breathless, No Mercy. None of them replicated the commercial force of An Officer and a Gentleman, and the industry, which had decided what Richard Gere was for, grew restless with his choices. He was cast in The Lords of Flatbush in 1974 and removed from the production after fighting with his co-star Sylvester Stallone. He played the first openly gay Holocaust victim on Broadway in Bent in 1979. He was, consistently, choosing roles that interested him rather than roles that consolidated the image the market had built around his face. The market noticed and was not pleased. The decade turned. Internal Affairs in 1990. Pretty Woman in 1990. 2 films, 2 wildly different modes, both arriving in the same year and together producing the second peak of his commercial career. Pretty Woman earned $463 million worldwide. It became one of the most profitable romantic comedies in the history of American cinema. He improvised the piano scene, the scene where Edward Lewis, in the hotel suite, plays Handel on a grand piano while Vivian watches. It was not in the script and ended up being integral to the film. He has joked that he was playing a character that was almost criminally underwritten, by which he meant that the film's real interest was Julia Roberts, and that his job was largely to not get in her way while being extremely handsome. He did not get in her way. He was also, in that same year, giving a quietly disturbing performance in Internal Affairs that nobody who had only seen Pretty Woman would have recognized as the same actor. And then, February 29th, 1993, the Academy Awards. He was presenting. He went off script. He looked into the cameras at a global audience and said, roughly, because the exact words have been quoted differently in various accounts, that with knowledge of the horrendous human rights situation in Tibet and China, he wondered if the audience could send love and sanity and truth to Beijing, if maybe that would cause the troops to leave Tibet and allow those people to live as free and independent people again. The Academy was not prepared. China was not amused. The response from Hollywood's commercial infrastructure was immediate, sustained, and, by Gere's own account in multiple interviews since, career-defining in its practical consequences. He was banned from presenting at the Academy Awards for 20 years. He did not present again until 2013. Directors began telling him, in conversations he has described in careful, factual detail, that they could not finance a film with him in it because it would upset the Chinese. A producer he does not name told him, directly, that a film they had planned together could not proceed with him attached. His 1997 film Red Corner, in which he played an American businessman accused of murder in China, a film that dealt explicitly with the Chinese legal system, was acquired by MGM and then effectively buried by the studio when China told them that releasing it would cost them access to the Chinese market. He has described receiving calls saying, "We don't want you doing press." MGM wanted a deal with China. China said no. They dumped the film. Have you ever paid a price for saying something true that you had calculated in advance and paid anyway? Leave a comment below. Because that calculation, the full, clear-eyed understanding of what the 1993 Oscars speech would cost, and the decision to make it anyway, is the thing that Richard Gere has never asked anyone to applaud him for, and which is, consequently, the most revealing thing about him. The 90s continued. Somersby in 1993, Primal Fear in 1996, in which he played a defense attorney opposite Edward Norton's extraordinary debut, and which produced one of the great final scenes of that decade. Runaway Bride in 1999, reuniting him with Julia Roberts in a film that did not approach Pretty Woman's velocity, but confirmed that whatever chemistry they had was structural rather than circumstantial. He married Cindy Crawford in 1991, and they divorced in 1995. She said later that at 22 she was still figuring out who she was, and he knew it, and she didn't want to hear it from him. He was linked publicly to Barbra Streisand, to Priscilla Presley, to Susan Sarandon. He was, in the tabloid sense, a presence that the gossip industry found perpetually useful. What the tabloids did not cover was the international campaign for Tibet, of which he became chairman, or the Gere Foundation, which he established to support Tibetan communities, refugees, and Buddhist institutions, or the countless private, unfilmed visits to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama lived in exile, which Gere made repeatedly over decades, not as a celebrity endorsement of a cause, but as a practitioner showing up to learn from a teacher he genuinely revered. He has said that when he reads the words of Jesus in a particular light, the light the Dalai Lama brought to them in a series of teachings on the Gospels that Gere attended in England, he heard them differently than he had heard them in the Methodist church of his childhood. He said it was as if he had never heard them before. He brought his son Homer, his son from his relationship with actress Carrie Lowell, named Homer for his grandfather and Jigme for a Tibetan name meaning fearless, to India for the first time as a young adult, and went directly to Dharamsala. He described himself, in that moment, not primarily as an actor, not primarily as an activist, but as a father watching his son encounter something large. He said, "I'm a dad. That's really what I am now." The career found a third act in a place nobody predicted. Chicago in 2002, the Adam Shankman and Rob Marshall musical that swept the Academy Awards, produced Gere's only Golden Globe win. He played Billy Flynn, the slick tap-dancing defense attorney, with a Broadway performer's timing and a movie star's ease, and reminded the industry that there were registers of performance it had never bothered to ask him for. Primal Fear had been one. Chicago was another. Arbitrage in 2012, a taut, morally complicated drama about a hedge fund manager trying to conceal a catastrophic mistake, was received as a genuine late-career revelation. The performance of a man who had found the material he had been looking for since days of heaven, and who was in complete command of it. In 2014, at 64 years old, staying at a family hotel in Positano, Italy, he met a 30-year-old Spanish publicist named Alejandra Silva. She did not, initially, know who he was. They looked at each other across a room and, she has said, felt an immediate and complete recognition, the sense of having known someone for a long time while simultaneously meeting them for the first time. He has called it the beginning of his real life, a statement that he appears to mean without irony. They married in April of 2018. The Dalai Lama blessed Alejandra's belly in a photograph that served as their pregnancy announcement. Their son Alexander was born in February of 2019. A second son followed in 2020. In 2024, the family relocated to Spain, Alejandra's home country, for her family, her roots, their son's bilingual education. He is still here. In 2025, he executive produced a documentary called Wisdom of Happiness about the Dalai Lama, who was then 89 years old. Gere has said he has never worked harder to get a film seen in the world. He has said it is important enough that he has to give his last bit of energy to put it out there for people to see. He said, at the very least it will put a seed in the minds of people who see it. He attended the film's premiere in New York alongside his wife, at 75 years old, in a pinstriped suit, looking, and this is simply, factually true, not significantly different from the man who stood in a rain-soaked factory yard in 1982 while the entire audience held its breath. He told an interviewer for El Espa that he and Alejandra were happier than ever. She said they were soulmates. He has been banned from China for 30 years for saying what he said at the Oscars. He has no apparent regrets. There is something in Richard Gere's story that the industry has never known what to do with. He arrived as an object of desire and chose to be a subject of conscience. He was given the most commercially powerful attribute American cinema offers: the face, the presence, the decade-level stardom, and he used it to say something that cost him the studio system's goodwill and the access to the Chinese market that had become, by the 90s, the single most important factor in whether a major film got financed. He did not make a dramatic speech about principle. He did not write a memoir about sacrifice. He simply, for 30 years, kept doing both things, the work and the advocacy, and absorbed the professional consequences of the second without apparent expectation of credit for either. He improvised a piano scene that became iconic. He played a character in Bent that Broadway in 1979 was not ready for. He chose Primal Fear when the smart commercial choice was a third film with Julia Roberts. He went to Naples in 1978, when going to Naples was not a career strategy. He married a woman 33 years younger than him in a ceremony at which the Dalai Lama blessed them, and moved to Spain at 74, because his wife's family was there and his children needed to know where they came from. He has spent 50 years being exactly who he is, at significant cost, and has never once appeared to require anyone's approval of the decision. What would you trade, what specific, valuable, professionally irreplaceable thing, for the ability to say exactly what you believe in the room where saying it matters most? Leave a comment below, because that is the trade Richard Gere made at the 1993 Academy Awards, and has been making quietly, in studios and in Dharamsala and in an Italian hotel in Positano every year since. He understood the cost. He paid it. He would pay it again. If this story found something in you, subscribe and tell me in the comments, which Richard Gere performance do you think showed the most of who he actually is? Because the most complete answer he has ever given to the question of what kind of man he is may not be in any film. It may be in the moment he looked into the camera at the Oscars in 1993, in front of the most powerful entertainment audience in the world, and decided that this was the right time, and this was the right room, and that the cost of staying silent was higher than the cost of speaking.